Hi, everyone. As you're joining, if you would put your information in the chat, we'd love to know who all is joining us today. We're going to give it one more minute and allow folks to join. I love seeing where everybody's from. Thank y'all for sharing. Keep it coming. All right, we are going to get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending today. My name is Lacey Hensley, and I'm the director of the Institute for Coordinated Community Response. So when we get started, we're going to do a couple of housekeeping items. We encourage you to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask questions throughout today's presentation. Our presenters will be monitoring that, and we'll answer those as they come up. If you'd like to make comments or interact with speakers and fellow attendees, be sure to select the all panelists and attendees option at the bottom of the chat so everyone can see what you've written. If you have any technical difficulties, in that instance, you'll select the all panelists option and I will try my best to assist you. So before we begin, a little bit of background on ICCR. We were created in 2018 as a program of the Conference on Crimes Against Women. ICCR is a training and technical assistance program whose mission is to work alongside rural communities to improve their collaborative systemic responses to domestic violence. ICCR hosts monthly webinar trainings, just like the one you're joining today, geared towards the needs of rural practitioners. In all of our trainings, we work to center the needs, unique needs and strengths of rural communities while providing practical skills and tools that can be immediately implemented. Thank you for being here today and for your dedication to improving your own community's domestic violence response. You can learn more about ICCR on our website, www.instituteccr.org, and I encourage you to sign up for our e-blast to stay in the loop about all of our great trainings we provide, including our free roll call trainings that we have included on our website. Lots of great information there. So now on to today's presentation. I would like to take a minute to introduce you to today's speaker. Fatima Jayoma joined the Sexual Violence Justice Institute at the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault in May of 2020. As a rural projects coordinator, she provides training and technical assistance to rural communities that aim to improve their systems and community response to sexual violence. She connects with and supports rural sexual assault response teams, or SARTs, and state territory level leaders throughout the country. Fatima is committed to working with rural communities to create a victim survivor-centered, trauma-informed, and collaborative response to sexual violence. She's been involved in the anti-violence movement since 2015. Prior to joining SVJI at Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault, she worked as a mobile multilingual advocate and prevention educator across Eastern Iowa. Fatima holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in social work and gender, women's, and sexuality studies, as well as a master's in social work with a concentration in integrated practice from the University of Iowa. We are happy to have you, Fatima, and Miranda Gonzalez is joining her. Miranda began her position as Rural Projects Coordinator in March of 2021. She supports rural communities' systems response to sexual violence by providing training, technical assistance, and developing resources. She has a passion for working with community-focused organizations to create systems change in response to sexual violence. Throughout her various roles, she has seen the importance of a community's role in the victim survivor's healing. She obtained her Bachelor of Science in Psychology and Criminal Justice at Loyola University. Afterwards, she became a legal advocate in a community-based dual organization. Outside of work, Miranda enjoys reading a good book and traveling to new places. Me too, Miranda. I haven't gotten to do enough of that lately. So thank you, ladies. I'm going to stop sharing and take it away. Thanks for being here.
Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on sexual assault response teams. This webinar is brought to you by the Sexual Violence Justice Institute at the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. So we will start today's webinar by defining some terminology. Afterwards, we are going to go over the 3 phases of systems change, which is a continuous improvement model for SARTs that is developed by SVJI. Then we're going to explore the general structure of a SART and some habits that make up effective teams. Before I continue, I want to share that this webinar is part of our rural project, which is supported by the Office on Violence Against Women. The opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations expressed in this webinar are those of SVJI and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women. So as Lacey mentioned, I am one of the presenters for today's webinar. Again, my name is Fatima, and I am one of the Rural Project Coordinators. My primary role is to provide training and technical assistance to rural SARTs and TA leaders who are working to improve their community and systems responses to sexual violence. And I'm here today with my coworker Miranda, and I'll let her introduce herself briefly.
Hi everyone, my name is Miranda Gonzalez, and I am the other Rural Projects Coordinator at SVJI at Mikasa. So I do the exact same thing as Fatima just described. And I'm very lucky that we share a role and she can always describe the role for me. Yeah, so that's a little bit about me.
So I know we already did this in the beginning, but it doesn't hurt to ask again. As we're getting started, we would love to get a chance to learn who is in today's webinar. If you would like, please chat in your name and answer the question, are you currently part of a SART? I'll give folks a few seconds to type in. Okay, we have some yeses coming. Oh, there are a lot of yeses. Awesome. No, some no's coming in, no worries. We have someone that's part of a SART for 6 counties. Wow, that is large. I'm curious to see how that works. Okay, so it looks like we're getting a pretty solid mix of folks. We have someone that is starting up a SART, so hopefully this webinar is helpful for you today. Okay, so as I mentioned, this presentation is brought to you by the Sexual Violence Justice Institute at the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. A little bit about MINCASA. MINCASA is a statewide coalition driving transformative culture change to address sexual violence through advocacy, prevention, racial justice, and systems change. We envision a world that is free of sexual violence, in which all human beings are treated with dignity and respect, and communities are transformed through safety, healing, and partnerships. So what does our work look like? We do advocacy. So we provide leadership and resources to advocates in providing services to all victim survivors in their communities. We also do some prevention work. So we work to prevent harm and address root causes of sexual violence using an anti-oppression lens. We also do racial justice work. So we are working towards a Minnesota where BIPOC survivors have access to safety, affirmation, and systems they can trust and use. And finally, we do systems change work and policy work. So we invest in community-focused work alongside our efforts to transform systems that are prioritizing underserved communities. We have 5 values. Our values are collaboration, integrity, courageous and bold action, prevent harm, and social justice. So often when we're introducing ourselves, people get confused because we kind of have 2 parts to our organization. We have the Sexual Violence Justice Institute and the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. So both are the same. The Sexual Violence Justice Institute is a national program that operates within the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. At SVJI, or the Sexual Violence Justice Institute, we work to create long-term sustainable systems responses to sexual violence that meet the specific needs of each community. What we offer. So this is just a little bit of a preview of what we offer, and hopefully through this, you can kind of figure out if we can provide support to you. So we offer training. We do webinars, workshops, conferences, and trainings on special topics. Some webinars we have some on protocol writing, case file review, community resource mapping, virtual engagement, and much more. We also develop resources. We have our SART starter kit, which is a great tool for folks who are just starting a SART. We have our case file review guidebook, which was just updated this year by Miranda. And we also have a community resource mapping tool and much more. You can find all of our resources on our website at svji@mincasa.org. If you are unsure of what resources you need or have trouble finding any resource, don't hesitate to reach out to us. We also provide support, which is also referred to as technical assistance. This is where we can assist you with brainstorming issues, assistance with SART meeting facilitation, and just general problem solving around a variety of issues. And finally, we are here as a point of connection. So if there is an issue that you bring to us that we're not able to provide assistance on, we will make sure and get you connected to the right people, such as other experts or technical assistance providers. Part of this also is that we can also assist in connecting you to your peers and mentors, so other SART coordinators across the country. We actually host a call once a month that allows SART and state level TA leaders from across the country to connect with folks who are doing similar work. So we call that the connection calls. I see there's a question in the chat. What is the website? I will put our website address in the chat.
All right, thank you, Fatima, for that introduction to our work. So now that we've spent a little bit of time talking about ourselves and what we do, we're going to spend time answering the question, what is a SART? So a SART is an abbreviation, often abbreviated for a sexual assault response team. I want to call out that depending on your community, you might call it something slightly different, but we're going to be using the term SART throughout this webinar to refer to essentially a multidisciplinary team. specifically focused on sexual assault, the response to sexual assault in a community. So SARTs are focused on collaboration and systems change work, where a bunch of disciplines gather and kind of look at the systems response. And they're also devoted to changing the response to sexual violence within the community using a continuous improvement process. One thing that I do want to call out, kind of getting into the names and abbreviations, is we will be focused on the response to sexual violence compared to the response to domestic violence, which is also a multidisciplinary group that gathers, that focuses on domestic violence, is often called a coordinated community response team, or a CCRT. So again, kind of a language differentiation, I'll say. But today we'll be focused on the response to sexual violence. And essentially a team is used as one strategy to improve the outcome of the response for victim survivors, and to increase victim survivor healing. When we're thinking about SARTs, we can think about them in two different buckets. So the first is an acute response SART. This is where a group of individuals comes together to focus on a single case. The folks that are on the team are those that are working on that specific case of sexual violence within their community. The changes that occur within the acute response teams are on an individual level, and it requires an individual participation. So the specific responders that are working within that case. The process of this type of team depends on each responder, and the results are targeted and include small scale change. So it's very individualistic, focused on one specific situation. On the other hand, systems change SARTs focus on case and processes and protocols as a whole. The changes that occur within these SARTs are on an agency and system-based level. Because of this, it requires that there's agency-wide participation. And we'll get into a little bit more about what that looks like later in the webinar. A systems change SART creates embedded processes, often called protocols, and the results are long-term and widespread change. Now, because we are rural project coordinators and we do really want to focus on the unique needs of rural SARTs, we wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about what those needs are. So oftentimes, when we're thinking about rural needs, we're thinking about a variety of landscapes, different needs, and different demographics compared to potentially suburban and urban areas. For example, a lot of rural programs may have a service area that spans multiple counties and may take several hours to drive, as an example of a need that folks are responding to. There may be similar issues, but different strategies that occur within a rural sexual assault response team. So, for example, sometimes there may be a prosecutor's office that consists of maybe 2 to 3 people that are serving an area, right? And if conflict comes up that involves that office, because there are 2 to 3 people involved in that conflict, the strategies used to work through that conflict on the team are going to look very different compared to like an urban area where a prosecutor's office might have, 50 to 40 employees. So when thinking about kind of the needs of SARTs and how to structure a team, the response needs to be tailored to that specific community so that it fits that community's needs. And also, one of the wonderful things about the needs of rural communities is that you can also build on the connection and the creativity and resilience of those rural communities. So just important, I know that's a general overview, but some things to keep in mind. All right. Next, we're going to be spending a little bit of time talking about what community actually is and systems change work. So when we're thinking about community, there's a few different ways we can conceptualize it. Essentially, it is a group of people that share something in common. So for example, it can be a geographical location, an ethnicity, a religion, etc. So for example, I live in Minnesota, and so I am in the community of being from Minnesota, but I'm also come from an advocacy background, and I'm in the community of the anti-violence movement. So that's just a couple of different ways that we can look at community. When we're thinking about learning our community and learning what a community looks like, you can think about it in a few different ways. First, who, right? What populations are within this specific community? Who is the leadership within that community? For example, it could include victim survivors, offenders, and system partners. Also thinking about what within that community. So this can include resources and services provided within a specific community. It can also include thinking about the needs and challenges that one community experiences, as well as current partnerships and also current levels of awareness or knowledge of the resources, needs, and partnerships that are within that community. We can also think about where. So this can include geography, neighboring jurisdictions, but it can also include things like the weather, traditions, languages, and beliefs and values that are found within specific communities. Lastly, we want to think about the how. So how are all of these things working together? Some questions that you can kind of ask yourself to get started is, where do people go within that community for help after experiencing sexual violence? What do people in the community know about sexual violence or about the services provided within their community? And then also, what do you think is needed to improve the response to sexual violence within the community? So that's one way that we can think about community, especially as it relates to sexual violence. When we're thinking about systems, essentially a system is a set of interconnected parts that make up a whole, right? Each part can be both a system on its own and part of a bigger whole. So for example, law enforcement, you may have a police force and a sheriff's office working within the same jurisdiction, depending on your community. Those will be two separate systems within itself, but they also encompass the system of law enforcement. When we're thinking about the system's response and interactions between systems, we want to think about it like a web. So there are parts where the systems will overlap and communicate with each other, these kind of collaboration points. So, for example, when law enforcement refers a case of sexual violence to prosecution, that is a point of collaboration. So another thing that I do like to point out kind of with this graphic and thinking about systems is that there are gaps in the systems, right? And there are some points of communications, but when we're thinking about it like a web, our goal of systems response and systems change is to close those barriers and strengthen the connections between the web.
Perfect. So now we're going to talk about systems change. Oh, Miranda, can you click again? I think there's a... Awesome. So what is systems change? Systems change is working towards improving individual systems responses to sexual violence while also increasing collaboration between systems. Again, when we're saying systems, we are referring to advocacy, prosecution, health professionals, law enforcement, probation, and any community agency that is responding to sexual violence. Systems change works to enhance the strengths of practice, policy, procedures, and collaboration. As they are enhancing those strengths, they are also addressing the shortcomings of the practices, policies, procedures, and collaboration. Systems change work also ensures that there is support and engagement for victim survivors throughout all the processes. So this work also focuses on continuously improving over time as communities change. So this is just our definition of systems change in SART work. At SVJI, we advocate for SARTs to use the 3 phases of systems change model. This model includes 3 phases that can guide teams as they work together in improving their responses to sexual violence. The 3 phases are assess the status quo, make change, and measure the change. So we're going to go through these phases one by one and provide some activities that teams can take on as they are in these phases. The first phase on the slide is assess the status quo. In this phase, teams are focusing on finding out 2 sets of information. 1, what is happening for victim survivors who are experiencing sexual violence? 2, what does the response to sexual violence look like? So answering those questions or just generally assessing the status quo will help a team determine a meaningful area of impact or change. In this phase, teams are really hoping to also identify the strengths, gaps, and barriers that need to be addressed to better meet the needs of survivors in the community. So there are 3 activities on the slide that teams can take on during this phase. One of them is taking inventory of existing providers, also known as community resource mapping. So that activity is figuring out who is in the community, who is responding to sexual violence. Are there any gaps that exist in services? So we actually have a new resource on this that we can send to all of you after. And any resource we talk about in today's webinar, we'll make sure to send you in a follow-up email. Next on the slide is bringing up the voices of victim survivors. So in order to create effective and survivor-centered responses, it's really crucial to bring in the voices of victim survivors. One way to do that is by learning from survivors in the community about their experiences seeking support and navigating the various systems. And finally, there is conducting a community needs assessment. So this can be done through a formal or informal process, depending on what resources are available to your team. A community needs assessment generally can help identify gaps in services, areas for improvement, and future opportunities for collaboration. So on the slide, we have some 3 additional strategies that are in bold. We have mapping out the current response, which sounds really similar to community resource mapping, but it's an entirely separate activity. This activity involves figuring out what the current response is. So what is currently happening when responding to sexual violence victim survivors? An activity like that can be useful for both new and existing teams. And by mapping, you can really figure out where there needs to be changes in the response. Next is observing service providers, so gaining insight into the strengths and limitations of current services, and again, identifying areas of improvement. Something like that can be done through a variety of methods, such as shadowing, conducting interviews, or reviewing case files. And finally, there's forming curious questions. So this involves asking questions with an open and curious mindset and really seeking to understand the experiences and needs of victim survivors in your community. The second phase is making change. So most SARTs love to jump straight into this phase, but there's a reason why this is the second phase. In order to make impactful change, you have to take the time to learn what is happening. So once you assess the status quo, only then can you move on to this phase. This phase involves using information collected from assessing the status quo and prioritizing what needs to change about the response to sexual violence. On the slide are some activities that can be done in this phase. First is developing and revising interagency protocol. So for those who are unfamiliar or new to SART work, protocols provide a clear framework for how different agencies and providers should respond to sexual violence. It includes guidelines for communication, information sharing, and collaboration. Protocols also ensure that everyone involved in the response is working together effectively and efficiently. Next is identifying training to meet knowledge and practice gaps. So this activity involves assessments and learning the knowledge or practice gaps that exist. So hopefully through assessments, teams can work to identify what training needs are needed in order for the team to be effectively responding to sexual violence. And then finally, there's also making changes to programs, individual practice, tools, and resources. Some additional strategies. So there are 3 on the slide. We have cross-training with team agencies. So cross-training is a way to strengthen the coordinated response to sexual violence. Teams can do this to help better understand each member's role and responsibility. Additionally, there's changing information sharing practices and overall just increasing collaboration between services and responders.
Hey, Fatima, I didn't know if you saw there is a question in the Q&A.
Oh, let me check right now. So we have a question that says, tips for observing service providers without threatening the expertise of the agency. For sure. And I actually want to throw this maybe to Miranda, because I know this has come up with case file review often. Can you share a little bit about how similar reviewing and potentially, how potentially observing can cause maybe potential conflict points within the team?
Yeah. Thanks, Fatima. So I would say, as far as tips for observing service providers, a couple of things to keep in mind as you're exploring and like having this conversation. And one thing I want to call out with our strategy for systems change is that, like, assess the status quo. That phase can take teams several months, if not like a year, to go through. So it's not necessarily something that you would go through in one meeting. And so when you're exploring this conversation as to how to observe various service providers, I think part of it comes down to building that trust within the team that, this is a learning opportunity. It's not a performance review. And kind of thinking about it from that framework and building that trust, and also putting parameters within the observation of, okay, like, we're not going to be providing each other feedback. We're here to learn and observe, and then talk about kind of what we learned within like a team setting. So it can be something that's more structured to kind of alleviate some of that conflict. And then also, I think it does come down to building trust. And if your team is still in that trust building process, then it's thinking about within the making change phase, what actions do we need to do in order to build that trust as a team so that we can work towards observing services provided by various people in our community. Fatima, if you have anything to add, jump in.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. I was thinking of, I think when we talk about case file review, especially when we're reviewing cases, we're not like reviewing individuals who are responding. We're reviewing entire systems and learning how they are responding to sexual violence. I think Miranda nailed that spot on, that it is really about building trust. And part of that is also trusting the mission and vision of your SART team, which is overall should be around the idea of making sure the victim survivors have access to the various systems and services in your community. So yeah, I think the big response to that is making sure that you have some way to build trust and relationship in the community, and also maybe figuring out some conflict resolution strategies for if you're thinking about doing something like that.
We also did get another question about case file review, and I think we can answer that once we get into our last phase of system change.
Perfect. And I will refer to that question when we get there. And I might push it back towards you again, Miranda. So here are some additional strategies for change. We have team development. So if a team is new or restarting, the making change phase might just involve team development. So again, that involves formalizing a team, signing MOUs, creating mission and vision statements, developing values, creating timelines, and more. We also have development and adherence to victim-centered approaches and raising community awareness. So that could be either about the SART, the overall response, or just sexual violence in general. Another few strategies are creating innovative programming, either reporting options, auditing, or exams. And there's also adding critical SART members or doing inter and intra-agency trainings. Oh, I think we went backwards. Nice. So the final phase, this is when teams are measuring or evaluating the impacts and outcomes from the changes made in the second phase. So many folks are intimidated by this phase because evaluation can be difficult, but it is just as important as phase 1 and 2. Measuring change can help a team really understand how the changes have impacted the response and victim survivors who have experienced that change. Some activities that can be done in this phase include monitoring the implementation of change. So once changes have been identified and implemented, it's important to monitor their effectiveness and make adjustments as necessary. Monitoring also helps ensure that changes are being applied consistently and that any gaps or barriers that exist because of the change are also being addressed. Next, there's assessing gaps and barriers. So assessing the gaps and barriers that exist now that the change has been made. There's also doing surveys and focus groups. Again, this is listening and learning and reflecting on the impact of the change. And finally, the question we were asked in the last slide, which is reviewing cases. I was actually going to share that we weren't going to dive into this deeply now because we have an entire resource and webinar on this topic. But we do have a question in the chat regarding it, which is how often is case review performed? And part 2 is that case review of current cases. So I can answer this very briefly. How often is case review performed? So again, we have this in the 3rd phase. So by the time your team is developed, it'll probably take a while to get to this evaluation phase. I believe they are performed as often as you are updating your protocol or making change. The second part of that question is case review part of, or can you do case review of current cases? And I'll pass that along to Miranda because we have a pretty straightforward answer on that question.
Yeah. So we don't recommend reviewing current cases. When thinking about a systems change response, because they're doing it in an evaluation setting and also just due to confidentiality requirements of various disciplines, it can be really challenging to review cases that are still currently active. When reviewing, if you do review cases that are currently active or haven't been closed, that usually turns into more of an acute response for that specific case, as opposed to looking at the system and at the protocols as a whole. So that's why we typically recommend reviewing closed cases. Yeah, that's kind of case file review is one method of evaluation. But as Fatima's kind of mentioned, it's not necessarily the only method of evaluation that teams can do. We also have, I'll just read this question. I don't know if Fatima, if you would like to jump in. Do you have examples of reporting options, audits, and exams?
Yeah, so I noticed that question. And so in the last slide, when I said that a making change strategy could be creating innovative programming. I don't have specific examples of that, but really what that means is as you assess the status quo, you might have recognized that there aren't specific paperwork that shares what reporting options are for victim survivors. So something your SAR could do is focusing on making sure survivors are aware of their reporting options. Additionally, you might notice that maybe there aren't a lot of forensic exams that are happening in your community. So maybe your team can work on making sure that that programming exists. If not, making sure that survivors are aware that that's an option and know where to go outside of the community to get those exams. Okay, so I mentioned almost all of these strategies in the previous slides, so I'll just share the last one, which is including victim survivor voices in the evaluation process. As we've mentioned a couple of times already, victim survivors are the center of our work and the center of SART work. So it's really crucial that victim survivor perspectives are also part of the evaluation process. So systems change is a cyclical process. So when SARTs complete the measuring change phase, many think that that's the end of the process. Unfortunately, SART work is kind of never ending, especially if you follow this model. Like we mentioned in the definition slide, the systems change or 3 phases of systems change model is a continuous improvement process. So it just keeps going. So now that you've measured the change, you return to the first phase, assess the status quo, and see what you've learned and decide if there are any new changes that need to be made. So for those of you that are part of a SART or a part of any multidisciplinary team, we'd love for you to answer this poll. Where in the phases of systems change is your team? Is it assess the status quo, make change, or measure the change? Looks like we have about 30% participation, so we'll leave it open for just a little bit longer. Okay, feel free to continue responding in the poll, but it looks like we have about 50% participation. Based on those 50% who responded, exactly 50% are in the assess the status quo phase, with about 36% in make change and 14% in measure the change. So Miranda mentioned this, but assess the status quo and all of the phases, it takes a really long time. So your SART could be around for, a year and still be in the assess the status quo phase. Thank you all for responding. It's always nice to know where folks are at. So impact of teams. Miranda, you can just click through all the images that'll pop up on this slide. I forgot that we had little animations. So systems change SARTs can have a really large impact. Doing systems change work can have an impact on not only the team, but the center of our work, which is victim survivors, hopefully improving their experiences. SART work can also affect individual practices, agency policies, systems procedures, interagency collaboration. So this image is really just to show you that systems change work is really large. And that's often why it takes such a long time, because it's impacting all these different spaces and individuals. And I think now we're going to hand it off to Miranda, who will talk a little bit about the makeup of a SART.
Yeah, thanks, Fatima. All right, so now that we have spent some time grounding in what a SART is and kind of the differences and thinking about community and thinking about systems change work and some activities that teams can do, we're going to spend time talking about who is actually part of a sexual assault response team. So we can commonly think of kind of these two different groups when thinking about folks that are sitting on the sexual assault response team. So one is governmental partners, right? Folks whose discipline is somehow related or based within governmental practices. So this could include law enforcement, prosecutors, DAs, can also include corrections, probation, as well as adult protection or child protection. In addition, we can also think of community partners as being a part of the team. So this can include community-based advocacy. So depending on your community, you may have like a victim witness specialist. They're often called, sit on the team to represent like a prosecutor's office, and then also an advocate from a community-based organization to represent kind of that community advocacy as well. Medical providers, colleges, universities, depending on your community, it could also include faith communities, and culturally specific groups. When we're thinking about community partners, we're really thinking about where are there points of disclosure of sexual violence within the community, and where's kind of the response beginning, and can we invite those community members to be a part of this team because they're also part of the response. Yeah, for example, like I've worked with teams that have mental health providers that are a part of their SART because they are part of the response to sexual violence. When we're thinking about an idea of the team members themselves, we can think about team members in a couple of different ways. So first, especially with focusing on systems change, we're thinking about the team member as the agency or discipline that an individual person represents, right? So I mentioned this briefly at the beginning, but really in order for a SART to do systems change work, they really need the entire agency to buy into the team's work, not just the individual sitting on the team. Those individuals do have a specific role on the team, and we'll get into that a little bit more shortly. But really, when we're thinking about a team, it's the agencies themselves that are on the table. The agency empowers that specific individual to attend and be a liaison back and forth, but really, we're thinking about a commitment to the process with these various agencies. There are various graphics. There we go. All right, I'm not used to animations. A lot of times these agencies will commit to the SART via a memorandum of understanding or an MOU. So it's a very formalized process. When we're thinking about team members as individuals on the team, that specific person or persons, depending on the agency, is that discipline's expert, right? They are expected to kind of understand their agency's perspective and to be able to speak on behalf of their agency, and then also share back information that was discussed within the team meeting to their agency. So they are that agency liaison. They also are a contributor to various tasks and discussions within the team itself. So when we're thinking about individuals, yes, they're doing the work oftentimes, but then they're also sharing information back and forth between the agencies, and they understand kind of what their agency provides as well and shares that with the team. Lastly, I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about the site coordinator. The site coordinator is often the facilitator of the team and the coordinator of the team. So this is an individual who is not only facilitating team meetings, but potentially determining other team logistics. In addition, this is sometimes the person that will go and meet with new and individual agencies to kind of introduce agencies to start work, and is overall kind of one of the general point people. Depending on your team, the site coordinator's role can look a little differently. Oftentimes, I think we think of meeting facilitation and the coordinator setting the agenda, but that doesn't always have to be the case. We have worked with teams where the site coordinator kind of puts together all the logistics, but then a different team member is the one actually facilitating the meetings. All right, we just got a question. Who does peer review in a community where advocates and SAMEs are volunteers? That's a good question. So I think in terms of SART work, it would be thinking about, is there a liaison that, or who could be that liaison that would sit on the team in that particular instance, right? Are we inviting those volunteers or a volunteer who's in a leadership role to be on the CERT team itself, in order to do some of that peer review. Fatima, I don't know if you have anything else you'd like to add.
Yeah, I would say that if there aren't specific advocates or sexual assault nurse examiners or volunteers in your community, I really recommend reaching out to the International Association of Forensic Nurses. There should be a group in Texas that could hopefully guide you into finding an individual that can kind of be a liaison for that type of work. And if you, again, we're happy to help facilitate any referrals or anything like that. At the very end of this presentation, Miranda will be going over our contact information, so you have our emails.
All right. Thanks, Fatima. I also wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about subcommittees, thinking about it in terms of like a team member, but also just calling out kind of how subcommittees can be used within a team. So essentially a subcommittee is a small group of team members that are working towards a specific goal. Often these subcommittees are temporary and time specific. So for example, if a team is hosting a training or is facilitating a training within their community, there may be a subcommittee of team members whose role it is to meet more regularly while planning the logistics of the training. Another example could be during Sexual Assault Awareness Month, there might be a subcommittee of team members that plan various events that are sponsored by the CERT team. Subcommittees are an opportunity for shared leadership. So for example, that's going back to that conversation about a site coordinator, there may be a site coordinator that facilitates team meetings, but then also a different team member may facilitate that subcommittee meeting. And these subcommittees can also be helpful when there are many multidisciplinary teams within the community. So for example, we have a team that's based in Minnesota that has a quarterly multidisciplinary team meeting where like many people come together and share kind of what the team is working on as a whole. However, that team also has monthly subcommittee meetings depending on an agency's role and kind of what they can work on. So there's like an advocacy subcommittee and there's a protocol subcommittee as kind of examples. And those teams meet monthly. So if you have a lot of multidisciplinary teams within your community, subcommittees are a way to kind of handle some of the logistics so that people aren't in meetings multiple times a month. We do also want to spend a little bit of time reminding folks of this idea of a feedback loop. So when thinking about a specific team member as a liaison, we're thinking about that representative not only sharing information to the CERT team, but then also going back to their agency and sharing information with their discipline leadership. Essentially, we want to make sure that the agency feels connected to the team, not only that particular team member who's attending the meetings, but the leadership of an agency as a whole, right? In order to maintain or improve that buy-in into CERT work and systems change work. For example, if a CERT team is developing protocol, it would be that individual team member's responsibility to share any changes that the team may be doing in the revision process back with their agency leadership to ensure that it matches up with what services are being provided within that agency.
Okay, so the framework for CERT effectiveness. So this is the final part of today's webinar. This was a resource developed by us that lists out the internal and external factors that can lead to SART successes. So this was created a few years back, and it was based on SVJI visiting 17 systems change SARTs across the country and learning about what factors they agreed on would be most needed for effective teams. So on the slide, on the right hand of the slide, you will see the image of all of the internal and external factors. There are 6 internal ones and 4 external ones. None of the factors are more or less important than the other. And there really isn't a one right way or wrong way to use any of these factors. So like I said, this is a resource that we have. I'm sure we can send it to you afterwards as well, again, in the follow-up email. On the left-hand side, you see that there are 3 internal factors listed out, which is shared vision and model, diverse membership, and multi-level leadership. Shared vision and model, this internal factor, teams are more effective when they have a shared vision and model. So when there's a shared vision model, teams are better able to work towards a common goal because there's a common agreement. Additionally, a shared vision model can help potentially reduce team confusion and conflict, since they can overall clarify the team's purpose, which can improve member and community engagement. Next is diverse membership. So diverse membership involves diversity in individual identities and professions. So having diversity in both identities and professions is important for SART success. And that's because when teams come from different backgrounds and professions, they are able to bring a wide variety of perspectives. Having diversity also can help increase in buy-in and engagement from multiple core disciplines that are all related to the response of sexual violence. Additionally, it can also help ensure that important issues or gaps in services are not being overlooked or left unresolved, since there is a wide range of perspectives and experiences being brought to the team. Another internal factor is multi-level leadership. Miranda kind of mentioned this a little bit a couple slides ago, but it's really important that leadership comes from multiple disciplines within the team, and that interdisciplinary power imbalances are also acknowledged and addressed. So an example of what a team can do, like Miranda mentioned, is form a subcommittee and have someone that is not the site coordinator lead that subcommittee so that leadership is being shared. So we would love to check in quickly. Does your team have a mission or vision statement? Yes, no, or unsure? Okay, looks like we have about 51% that have participated so far. We have still increasing 57% who've said yes, 13 that have said no, and 30% that are unsure. So if you are unsure and are part of a SART team, this is a great time afterwards to probably check in to figure out if your team does have a mission and vision statement. Especially with COVID, I know a lot of teams really struggled to meet. So there might have not been a lot of opportunity to do the onboarding process and learn about the team. Additionally, we have about 15% that said no. So for those who are saying no, this would be a great opportunity to bring this back to your team and share that a mission or vision statement is a great way to alleviate points of tension and conflict within a team. In the starter kit that I mentioned in the very beginning, we actually have a resource on developing mission statements and how to write one. So again, we can include that in the follow-up email. I realize we are mentioning resources and are not dropping them in the chat, but don't worry, we will make sure to follow up with all the resources we've mentioned today. And that actually leads me to passing this along to Miranda, who will kind of close us off.
I'm doing great with my slide work today. I keep hitting buttons accidentally, so I apologize, everyone. All right, so kind of when we're thinking about these internal factors and thinking about the membership of teams, oftentimes Fatima and I get the question of, well, what if ABC agency won't participate? And I think oftentimes teams might be apprehensive to move forward in the work if they don't have, ABC agency regularly attending meetings. And a couple of things that we encourage folks to do while thinking about encouraging that buy-in from that agency is really doing a stakeholder analysis. So sometimes it's looking at who is doing the work in the community and where are their power dynamics at play, and also kind of what do we need to how can we foster that buy-in in order for that agency to participate? So sometimes it's taking a step back and kind of looking at the whole picture of your community to really think about how can we foster that buy-in. It can also include using your networks. So is there a person on the team or a person not on the team who can approach that agency and really explain the importance of SART work and systems change work in order to develop that buy-in. Also, sometimes community pressure can be helpful. So that can include sharing what the SART team is doing within the community. Not necessarily like detailed team meeting notes, but sharing updates kind of regularly with the community and who is on the team, and kind of explaining what a SART is to community members who may not be as involved with the response to sexual violence. And also showing results. So again, sometimes we often hear teams will come to us and say, well, we can't really do any work because this agency isn't coming to the meetings or isn't at the table yet. And what I would challenge individuals to think about is there other systems change work that we can do where maybe that agency doesn't necessarily need to be involved, and we can show what SART work is and kind of what systems change work will do for the response to sexual violence, to then encourage that agency to come to the team at a later date. So I think that's often a place where teams, especially like newer teams, get stuck. And so it's something to keep in mind is sometimes you don't have everyone at the table right away, and that's okay. And systems change work can still continue. All right, I'm now going to spend time talking about some of the other internal factors. So this could include, or these include creating a culture of learning, having a continual improvement model, and also an emphasis on relationships and teamwork. So really kind of developing that collaborative process. And with that, we are going to, there we go. All right, we are going to launch another poll. So one thing to think about too, when thinking about these internal factors is also power. So I will ask folks to answer this question. For some reason, the launch button is grayed out. Allow panelists to vote. Oh, it's because share results, stop sharing. There we go. All right, I had to hit an extra button. All right, our power balance is addressed on the team. So yes, no, or unsure. And if you would like, also in the chat, sorry, I'm not great at talking and hitting buttons at the same time. Okay. Hopefully it's working now. There we go. All right. So our power imbalances addressed on the team. And then if you'd like to share in the chat, how does your team address those power imbalances? We have about 50% participated now. I'll give folks a few minutes to finish up the poll. And then again, feel free to put in the chat how these power imbalances are addressed. All right, so we have about 16% of folks saying that yes, they are addressed, 32% saying no, and about 50% of folks saying unsure. Yeah, and I think that is a challenge to even think about, like, they might be being addressed on the team, but they might be being addressed on the team in an informal manner. One person shared in the chat, I don't think this has been a huge concern in the past, but our SART coordinator is great at bringing up concerns like this during meetings and addressing head-on through communications meetings with that individual agency. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, so oftentimes this thinking about power imbalances is related to how site coordinators facilitate meetings. And it can also be we can also think about it as how can we encourage other team members to address these power imbalances as well. And kind of with that, I'm also going to spend a little bit of time talking about conflict, because as kind of mentioned earlier, I think with the case file review question, tension points and conflict within teams is completely normal, and that's okay. Conflict is going to happen on teams, and that's because it is a diverse group of people that come from various disciplines, and those disciplines may have slightly different values. So there will be differences in agency goals and measures of success. For example, prosecution will often define a successful case as a conviction, versus advocacy may be more focused on, does the victim survivor feel that they have obtained justice and are beginning their healing process. There are going to be individual personalities on the team and individual power dynamics as well as there might be slightly different definitions for various terms. Like sexual violence might mean, again, one thing to law enforcement and a slightly different thing for an advocate. So there will be kind of those tension points that teams will have to work through. Really kind of the overarching theme of working through conflict is having an understanding of each other's roles and the limitations of each other's roles within the team as well. So because there will be differences, and that's what makes a team so helpful, are those differences, and just understanding and respecting that those differences will occur. All right. We also wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the external factors that SART teams find make them a successful team. So external factors are things that team members maybe, or that the team has like less actionable control over as they exist outside of the team itself. So this can include the confidence of individual SART members, having supportive agencies, access to resources and networking, and also community support and input. Are kind of the 4 external factors that we like to think of. So for example, access to resources and networking within a rural community, depending on your community, might look slightly differently. I think especially now with technology and folks being able to attend more virtual training options, teams are able to kind of have greater access to resources than maybe they would before the pandemic, when a lot of trainings were held more in person. But also, how are we thinking about kind of that networking as well within rural communities? Which brings us to kind of our last question that we get asked often within this work is, why can't we just do what XYZ community is doing? You know, why can't we just do SART work like the community next to us is doing? And overall, we would really like you to think about how communities are different, right? Service providers are going to, and what services are provided in a community are going to look slightly different depending on what those community needs are. Resources might be slightly different between jurisdictions or between various geographical locations. Demographics of the community that is being served are going to be different. You know, going back to that definition of community at the beginning of the presentation, right? It's really a group of people that share something in common. So the demographics for a community that surrounds a college or university is going to be very different compared to the demographics of a community where the focus is more like, maybe there's like a lot of like farmers or like other, or not a university, right? Those demographics are going to look slightly differently. And then also geography and kind of where you are in the world will have an impact on what your team looks like and how the team is run. So with that, I will save a few minutes if anyone has any questions that have come up. Feel free to put them in the Q&A and I will do my best to answer them.
I don't see any questions. Anyone have any last minute questions?
As people are thinking, I'll also just put our contact information on the screen. So there's mine and Fatima's email, as well as our website. And I will share out the resources that we've been mentioning throughout the webinar with Lacey as well.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, thank you again, Miranda, for joining us. I know Fatima had to hop off a little early. So I'm going to share my screen again really quickly. I have a couple of announcements for you guys. Thank you all for joining us today. We're really excited to announce our 3rd annual virtual rural conference. I know some of you have attended in the past. It's going to be October 2nd and 3rd. Registration will be opening soon, but we are soliciting submissions for the conference. If you are interested in presenting, please scan the QR code and we'll be taking submissions through June 15th. We hope that you'll consider submitting, and all submissions will need to have some type of rural element in order to be considered. And then finally, we hope that you will join us at our conference on crimes against women in 2 weeks at the Sheridan in Dallas, May 22nd through the 25th. You won't want to miss it. For more information, you can register at our website, conferencecaw.org, or visit the QR code there. And attendees, today at the end of the webinar, you'll get a survey that will populate in your browser. Please take a few minutes to complete it in order to receive your certificate. And the survey link will also be sent in a follow-up email. A recording of today's presentation will be available on the ICCR website within 24 hours, and we will also have a follow-up email with a PDF of the slide deck. Hope you have a great day. Thank you for joining us.